The Turn of the Screw, a modern-day haunting. A dark cloud loomed over Bly Manor, a centuries-old estate nestled deep within the English countryside. For years, rumors whispered of strange occurrences within its ivy-clad walls, but few dared to speak of it in detail. That changed when Lydia Evans, a historian with a fascination for haunted estates, decided to spend a week at Bly to document its history. What Lydia uncovered became one of the most terrifying true accounts of supernatural horror, known as the Turn of the Screw. Lydia was skeptical of ghost stories. She believed they were just folklore, exaggerated tales woven by fear. But Bly was different. There was something about the manor's silence, the way the air seemed heavier as she approached it. The caretaker, an old woman named Mrs. Groves, was waiting for her at the entrance, clutching a brass key that gleamed despite the overcast sky. "Be careful in there," Mrs. Groves warned, her voice low. "Bly has a way of holding on to things." Lydia smiled politely, dismissing the warning as mere superstition. She had come prepared to catalog records, take photos, and maybe, if she was lucky, capture some odd creaks and groans of an old house. Settling. But what she encountered inside was far more sinister. On the first night, after a day of exploring Bly's endless rooms and shadowed hallways, Lydia retired to her temporary study. She felt a presence, something watching her as she sifted through papers. Dismissing it as paranoia, she continued her work. But just as she was about to call it a night, she heard it. A faint, childlike laugh coming from upstairs. Her heart raced. The house was supposed to be empty, save for her and Mrs. Groves. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously ascended the grand staircase. As she reached the landing, the laughter stopped. A door down the hallway creaked open slightly. Behind that door, Lydia discovered a nursery, long abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. Tiny handprints marked the fogged-up window, though it hadn't been opened in years. In the corner of the room stood a dollhouse, an exact replica of Bly Manor. Inside the dollhouse, tiny figures had been arranged, 2 children and a governess, posed in unsettling scenes of terror. One figure had been moved since Lydia last looked at the room earlier that day. Shaken, Lydia returned to her study, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Footsteps echoed in the halls, even though no one was there. Lydia would hear whispers in her ear, but when she turned, the room was empty. Mrs. Groves refused to come inside, staying in the caretaker's cottage and speaking less and less with each passing day. On the 4th night, Lydia awoke to the sensation of someone sitting at the edge of her bed. Slowly, she opened her eyes and saw the faint outline of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face obscured by shadow. Beside her stood 2 children, their pale faces watching Lydia intently. Terrified, Lydia tried to move, but her body was paralyzed. The woman leaned in close, her cold breath brushing Lydia's cheek. "The children need you," she whispered, her voice a chilling rasp. "Save them, before it's too late." With a jolt, Lydia regained control of her body and bolted from the room. She fled to the caretaker's cottage, pounding on the door until Mrs. Groves let her in. "What's happening?" Lydia gasped. "Who are those children?" Mrs. Groves hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You've seen them, haven't you? The spirits of Flora and Miles, their governess, Miss Jessel, and the former valet, Peter Quint. They were taken by something evil long ago. Their souls are trapped here, playing out their final days in endless torment." Lydia wanted to leave immediately, but something compelled her to stay. She had to know the truth. She spent the next 2 days digging into Bly's past, uncovering the tragic story of Miss Jessel and Peter Quint. They had been involved in a twisted, dangerous relationship that led to their deaths. The children, too, were said to have died under mysterious circumstances. The final night was the worst. As Lydia prepared to leave, she heard the children's voices again, louder this time. They pleaded with her, calling her name, begging for her help. Against her better judgment, Lydia followed the voices up to the attic. There, she saw them, the spirits of Flora and Miles, standing hand in hand. Behind them stood Peter Quint, his eyes burning with malice. "They're mine," he hissed. "You cannot take them." The air grew freezing cold, and Lydia felt her breath leave her body. She collapsed to the floor, the world spinning around her. As darkness overtook her, she heard the children's voices one last time, fading into the distance. Lydia woke up the next morning in a hospital bed. Mrs. Groves had found her unconscious in the attic, barely alive. Lydia left Bly Manor that day, vowing never to return. But the experience haunted her, leaving her with vivid nightmares and an unshakable feeling that the spirits of Bly had followed her home. The estate remains abandoned to this day, its haunted legacy living on in whispered stories and eerie folklore. But Lydia knows the truth. Bly Manor is not just a story. It's real, and its spirits are still waiting, watching for someone to return. The haunting continues. It had been months since Lydia Evans escaped the clutches of Bly Manor, but her life had not returned to normal. Though she had physically left the estate, her mind remained trapped within its haunted corridors. Sleep had become a luxury she rarely enjoyed, her nights plagued by vivid nightmares of the children, their pale faces staring at her from the foot of her bed, whispering her name. In her waking hours, Lydia struggled to convince herself that what she had experienced was real. She had tried to return to her work as a historian, but every time she opened a new book or researched another estate, her mind drifted back to Bly. The echoes of that cursed place had seeped into her everyday life, making her question what was real and what was the product of her fractured psyche. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, Lydia received a letter. There was no return address, just her name, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside, the note read, "Bly is not done with you. Come back before it's too late." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. Who could have sent this? Mrs. Groves? A prankster? Or was it something more sinister? Against her better judgment, Lydia decided to return to Bly Manor. This time, she wasn't going as a historian or a skeptic. She was going to confront whatever dark force resided there, to end the torment that had followed her since her last visit. Armed with equipment to record any paranormal activity, Lydia arrived at Bly as dusk fell, the sky painted in hues of red and purple, casting an eerie glow over the manor's stone facade. The house seemed to be waiting for her, its towering silhouette looming over her like a predator stalking its prey. Mrs. Groves was nowhere to be seen. The caretaker's cottage was dark, its windows boarded up. Lydia wondered if the old woman had fled, unable to bear the weight of the manor's dark secrets any longer. As Lydia stepped through the creaking front doors, the familiar smell of must and decay washed over her. The temperature dropped immediately, and she felt the oppressive presence she had sensed before. Something was here, watching, waiting. Determined not to let fear overtake her, Lydia began setting up her recording equipment in the grand foyer. She placed cameras at key points in the house: the nursery, the attic, and the study where she had first encountered the children. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, shadows flickering at the edges of her vision. By midnight, the manor was silent. Lydia sat in the study, reviewing footage from the cameras. For hours, there was nothing, just the stillness of an old house. But then, around 2 a.m., something changed. The camera in the nursery captured movement. The dollhouse, untouched since her last visit, shifted slightly. The tiny figures inside, Miss Jessel, Peter Quint, Flora, and Miles, had moved. Lydia's pulse quickened. She rewound the footage, watching in disbelief as the tiny figures seemed to rearrange themselves. The children now posed as if they were looking directly at the camera. A cold wind blew through the room, and suddenly, the temperature dropped dramatically. Lydia grabbed her flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness as she made her way upstairs to the nursery. Her footsteps echoed in the hollow silence. The nursery door was ajar, just as it had been that first night. As she stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and dust filled her lungs. The dollhouse stood in the corner, just as it had in the footage, but now something was different. The tiny figures inside were gone. A child's laughter echoed behind her. Lydia spun around, her flashlight catching a brief glimpse of a figure, small, pale, and impossibly fast, darting across the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt a cold hand brush against her back. Turning, she came face to face with Flora, the young girl she had seen before. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with fear. "They're coming," Flora whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to save us." Before Lydia could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. The flashlight flickered and went out, leaving her in pitch black. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from behind. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Lydia's body seized with fear. A deep, malevolent voice cut through the silence. "You should have stayed away." Peter Quint's voice. It was unmistakable. Lydia's pulse pounded in her ears as she backed up against the wall, her eyes frantically searching for a way out. She could feel him, his presence looming closer, his breath cold against her skin. The door slammed shut, trapping her inside. For what felt like hours, Lydia remained frozen, the oppressive energy of the room pressing down on her. Then, without warning, the flashlight sputtered back to life. The room was empty, no sign of Flora or Peter. But Lydia knew better. She wasn't alone. She ran. Down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the front door into the cold night air. As she reached her car, she glanced back at the manor. In the window of the nursery, she saw them, Flora, Miles, Miss Jessel, and Peter Quint, watching her. Their eyes followed her every move. Lydia drove away, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She had come to confront the spirits of Bly, to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed her life. But she realized now that there was no escape. Bly Manor was not just haunted. It was alive, a malevolent force that fed on the souls of those who dared enter its walls. As she drove further from the manor, Lydia glanced in her rearview mirror. For a brief moment, she saw a reflection of something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. A small figure, with pale skin and wide, unblinking eyes. Flora's voice echoed in her mind. "You have to save us, before it's too late." Lydia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She knew now that Bly's grip on her would never loosen. The spirits of the manor had followed her, and until she returned to free them, they would haunt her every step, every breath, every waking moment. The turn of the screw had begun once again. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that Bly Manor had never truly let her leave. Even as she drove farther from its cursed grounds, the lingering presence of the manor weighed on her like a heavy shadow. The cold dread in her chest grew with every mile. She tried to tell herself it was over, but deep down, she knew the truth. Bly was far from done with her. The days after her second visit were even worse than the first time she had fled. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and disturbing than before. Every night, she was back in the nursery, Flora and Miles standing in front of her, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in silent pleas for help. And always, lurking just behind them, was Peter Quint, his malevolent grin burning into her soul. The line between dream and reality began to blur. Lydia found herself waking up at strange hours, cold sweat clinging to her skin, only to hear footsteps in her hallway or catch glimpses of shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed. At first, she tried to convince herself it was stress, the trauma of Bly affecting her mind. But the occurrences became more frequent and more real. One evening, as Lydia sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender, the subject line reading, "You can't leave them behind." Her heart raced as she opened the message. It contained a single image, grainy, distorted, but unmistakable. It was a photo of Bly Manor, the window to the nursery dimly illuminated. In the shadows, Lydia could just make out two figures, Flora and Miles, watching, her breath caught in her throat. Who had sent this? How could anyone have known what was happening to her? In a panic, Lydia called Mrs. Groves, the one person who might have answers. The phone rang several times before the elderly caretaker finally picked up. Her voice was shaky, tired, as if she had been waiting for this call. "I told you not to go back," Mrs. Groves said, her voice thick with regret. "Bly doesn't let go, not once you've seen them. They're lost, but they'll never stop trying to escape." "What do I do?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. "How do I get rid of them?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You can't," Mrs. Groves whispered, not without finishing what they started. Lydia's mind raced. She didn't understand. "What do you mean? What started?" Mrs. Groves sighed, the weight of years of secrets hanging heavy in her voice. "The children, Flora and Miles. They were never meant to die. Their souls are trapped because of what Quint did. He used them, twisted them for his own gain, and now they're stuck in a cycle, reliving their final days over and over. They want to be free, but they don't know how." Lydia felt a chill run down her spine. "So how do I free them?" Mrs. Groves hesitated. "There's a ritual, something old, forbidden. I don't know much about it, only that it's dangerous. It requires you to face them, to face Quint, and take back what he stole from them. But be warned, once you start, there's no turning back. If you fail, you'll be trapped with them." The words echoed in Lydia's mind long after she hung up the phone. Could she really go back to Bly? Could she face Peter Quint and whatever darkness he had unleashed on the manor? And what if she failed? Would she become just another lost soul, wandering Bly's endless halls for eternity? But Lydia knew there was no choice. The spirits of Flora and Miles weren't just haunting Bly anymore. They were haunting her, and until she set them free, she would never be rid of them. The following week, Lydia prepared for her return to Bly Manor. She researched the ritual Mrs. Groves had spoken of, piecing together fragments of old texts and occult symbols, none of which fully explained how to perform it. The details were vague, but the core of the ritual seemed to involve confronting the spirits directly, forcing them to confront their pasts and breaking the hold Quint had over them. Lydia gathered everything she could think of that might help. Candles, salt, an old mirror she'd read could be used to reflect spirits back into the realm they came from. But as she packed, the weight of what she was about to do pressed on her chest. She wasn't a paranormal investigator or a medium. She was a historian, and yet here she was, preparing to walk into one of the most haunted places in England to perform a ritual that might very well kill her. On the night of the full moon, Lydia returned to Bly Manor. The manor was just as she had left it, dark and foreboding, its windows like black eyes staring into her soul. The air around the estate was thick, almost alive with energy. As she stepped through the front doors, it was as if Bly was waiting for her, eager to finish what it had started. The nursery was her destination. She climbed the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her ears. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning, every flicker of shadow like a threat. As she reached the landing, she heard it again, the soft, childlike laughter that sent chills down her spine. In the nursery, the air was thick with the presence of the children. Flora stood near the window, her back turned to Lydia. Miles was sitting in the corner, his eyes downcast, as if waiting for something. Lydia set up the candles in a circle, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. "I'm here to help you," Lydia whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here to set you free." Flora turned slowly, her eyes wide and filled with sadness. "You can't help us," she said, her voice soft but filled with despair. "He won't let you." Suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted and the door slammed shut. Peter Quint's deep, menacing voice filled the air. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing." Lydia's breath caught in her throat as a dark figure emerged from the shadows, Quint's cold, soulless eyes locking onto hers. He moved toward her, his presence suffocating, his rage palpable. "You'll never be free of me," he snarled, his voice dripping with malice. Lydia stood her ground, her heart racing but her determination stronger than ever. She raised the mirror, reflecting his twisted image back at him. "You don't belong here," she shouted. "This isn't your place anymore." Quint recoiled, his form flickering, as if the mirror's reflection was weakening him. The children watched, their eyes wide with hope. But Quint wasn't done. With a roar, he lunged at Lydia, the air around them vibrating with dark energy. Lydia held the mirror steady, forcing herself to stay calm. "You have no power here anymore," she repeated, her voice stronger now. The room erupted in a whirlwind of energy, Quint's form twisting and distorting as he fought to maintain his hold on the manor. But Lydia could see it. He was weakening, his grip on the children slipping. With a final desperate scream, Peter Quint vanished, his presence sucked into the mirror, leaving only silence behind. The air grew still. Lydia collapsed to the floor, her breath ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion. When she looked up, Flora and Miles were standing in front of her, their faces peaceful, their eyes no longer filled with fear. "Thank you," Flora whispered, her voice soft and full of relief. And just like that, they were gone. Their spirits, finally free, faded into the air, leaving Bly Manor eerily quiet. Lydia left the manor for the final time, her heart heavy but at peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had freed the children. But as she drove away from Bly, she couldn't shake the feeling that the manor's darkness still lingered, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross its threshold.